Okay, Michael, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Michael Road, Border Shore, hallelujah. Michael Road, Border Shore, hallelujah. Michael Road, Border Shore. Now, hang on. Michael, can you hear me?
لا أم كلثوم
Michael Bloomberg, can you hear me? No?
أم كلثوم
عرب. Michael, can you hear me? لا خصني ندير لها بس. Michael Road, Border Shore, hallelujah. Michael. Can you hear me, Michael? Can you hear me? Okay, good.
Ibrahim, English channel, can you hear me?
Welcome to the Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Africa. Please make your way to your seat. Our program will begin in 15 minutes. As a courtesy to our speakers and those around you, we ask that you please silence all electronic devices at this time.
The world's new economies are ascending. They're dynamic, sustainable, resilient, and they're powering the prosperity we all seek. Bloomberg New Economy is the gateway to this potential. Global in scope, regional in focus, local in context. We build bridges, build engagement, and drive progress. Gateways are where we explore real solutions to regional challenges by bringing together the best of the private and public sectors. Bloomberg New Economy. The connection starts here.
Our program will begin in 5 minutes. Please make your way to your seat. take your seats. Our program will begin shortly. Please take your seats. The show will now begin.
pulse of a continent is beating with new vigor. This is Africa's moment. Free trade and digitization are transforming economies. Industry and entrepreneurship are uplifting communities. Africa is harnessing the sun, the wind, and the energy of innovation to grow sustainably. And its mineral riches are playing a crucial role in the transition to a cleaner world. Africa is no stranger to conflict or the ruinous rivalries of great powers. And this fragile land remains vulnerable to our changing climate. Yet Africa is building resilience and deciding its future with confidence. This is the time to believe, to invest, to inspire.
انا كندير جوجل ولينغوي كنخدم دائما جوجل ولينغوي. لا لينغوي ما يديرش يا دوكيمون، لينغوي كيعطيني لو مو سميتو اللي كنقلب عليه انايا، كنمشي للكونتكست وكنقلب عليه.
Please welcome
شنو دابا كاين الانترنت هنايا؟
and Bloomberg Philanthropies and 3
شنو الانترنت ديال هنا عرفتيه ولا ما عرفتيش؟
انا داير التليفون.
راه كاين بلومبرغ يمكن شي واحد محلول.
Welcome to Marrakesh and to our first Bloomberg New Economy Gateway Africa. We have a great group assembled and lots to discuss. Over the next 2 days, you'll take part in conversations on the many challenges facing the planet. A slowing global economy, rising food and energy costs, tightening financial conditions, and an accelerating climate crisis. These changes affect every region and industry, and confronting them will require creativity and boldness, and public-private partnerships. That's what the Bloomberg New Economy is all about. Working together, we can drive innovation and create new jobs, strengthen international relationships, and build a more sustainable and equitable future. Africa plays a critical role in all of those areas. It's an economic engine and global trade gateway, and increasingly a key leader in our planet's fight against climate change. Morocco is at the center of it all. So let me extend my gratitude to His Majesty King Mohammed VI, the Prime Minister and the Minister of Investment, for bringing us to Morocco and for their support in making this event a success. I'm looking forward to the results. Now let's get started.
Please welcome the head of government of the Kingdom of Morocco, His Excellency Aziz Akhanouche.
Mesdames, Messieurs, bonjour. Je vous souhaite
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Marrakesh for the Bloomberg New Economic Gateway Africa. I would like to congratulate the organizers of the first edition of this forum on the African continent, which will showcase the tremendous potential of Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, His Majesty King Mohammed VI, may God assist him, stated during one of his speeches for the Morocco Ivory Coast Economic Forum in 2014 that Africa must trust in Africa. Africa's self-assurance is very important because it has considerable natural resources and its youthful bringing population is very talented. Today, Africa has embraced its new role and takes great pride in showcasing its strengths, strategically positioning itself with the global values, and far from succumbing to protectionism. It is in Africa that FCTA, which is one of the largest free trade zones in the world, has emerged. Ladies and gentlemen, over the past 20 years, Morocco has significantly enhanced its exchanges with its continent of belonging, emerging as a leading African investor in Western Africa and the second largest in the continent. Under the leadership of His Majesty King Mohammed VI, may God assist him, the kingdom has successfully positioned itself as a strategic player within its regional sphere. With confidence and boldness, we have undertaken institutional reforms in order to uphold democracy, and we built a diversified and solid economy supported by sectorial visionary strategies and the infrastructures are now at the best international standards, as well as a very performing industry. The financial, agro-industrial, automotive, aerospace, textile, pharmaceutical sectors, and many others serve as benchmarks worldwide nowadays. Morocco is the leading producer of renewable energy in Africa, and we are placed as a significant player for the forthcoming energy transition. Under the enlightened guidance of His Majesty the King Mohammed VI, Morocco is entering now a new phase of its development. This phase is characterized by the establishment of a social state based on the universalization of social protection for the entire population, as well as a profound reform of our educational and healthcare systems. The Kingdom has also adopted an investment charter aimed at fostering the emergence of a new generation of entrepreneurs and investors who will support the expansion and involvement of the private sector. Furthermore, thanks to its attractive business climate, Morocco enjoys broad international recognition from several organizations and international rating agencies, which testifies to its political economy and social resilience and stability. Ladies and gentlemen, our geographical location, energy assets, and robust infrastructure make Morocco an ideal partner for the restructuring of the continent within its value chains recomposition and at continental level. Throughout its rich history, the Kingdom of Morocco has played the role of a gateway or a bridge connecting Africa to Europe and fostering reliable and sustainable partnerships, and now this is part of the Kingdom's DNA. The event we currently partake today is bearing a very fitting name, and the first organization of this event in Morocco is not by chance. I thank you very much, and I wish full success to this forum. Great success.
Please welcome to the stage Editorial Director of Bloomberg New Economy, Eric Schatzker.
Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome to Bloomberg New Economy's Gateway Africa. I have to tell you, it is a thrill for me and for all of us at Bloomberg to see you here in Marrakesh. I hope you have a chance to explore this beautiful ancient city and delight in Morocco's exceptional sights, its sounds, its tastes, and its cultural traditions. This is our first gateway in Africa, and the timing could not be more ideal. I want you to think for a moment about the forces that are transforming our economies, our societies, our world. Climate change, technology, demographics, geopolitics, disease, and of course war continues to rage in Ukraine, disrupting critical supplies and fueling inflation. These forces are all reshaping life and business here in Africa. There's no question this continent's future has never been brighter, yet that future remains far from certain. That is why we're here. We built this gateway around the twin themes of sustainability and resilience. Africa will need both to overcome the many challenges that lie in the years ahead. You'll see those themes reflected throughout our program. Above all, we're going to showcase Made in Africa solutions. I'm excited, and I'm excited for you. These next 2 days are going to be fun, they're going to be provocative, and at times they're going to be demanding. We want to earn every single ounce of your attention. But more than anything, we want you to have an experience to remember, learning from one another and building relationships to last. My colleagues and I are here to help. Don't hesitate to ask any one of us with a green stripe you'll see at the bottom of our badges. We'll do everything we can to make your experience a memorable one. Right now, I have a few important notes to share with you. Should you need it, there is closed captioning at either side of the plenary hall on the screens you'll see there and there. There's also simultaneous translation. There are headsets at your chairs. You'll find English on channel 1, Arabic on channel 2, and French on channel 3. As a courtesy to your speakers and to your fellow delegates, please silence your mobile phones and take any calls you receive outside the plenary hall. Also, please, please, please listen carefully to announcements. There may be some scheduling changes. We want to make sure that you're back in the plenary hall on time. I want you to share. I want you to share what you're learning. I want you to share who you're meeting. And I want you to share what a great experience you're having here at the New Economy Gateway Africa. There is a hashtag we use for this. It's hashtag New Economy Gateway. Please use it. Get out there on your preferred social platforms. And finally, we want to hear from all of you. This is a participatory event. There is a QR code you'll see right behind me there. Using that, you'll be able to submit questions, yes, to our moderators. You can submit questions to our moderators. Of course, it is up to them to decide which questions to use, but please feel free to submit questions. And I also want you to participate in live polling. So please scan that QR code now with your phones. And if for some reason it isn't working, you should see in a moment, if it isn't there yet, a URL which you can plug into your smartphone browser. It is BBG event, so bbgevent.app/BNE. I hope you all have that up. So to get things going, let's do a practice poll, everybody. The practice polls are polls in which there are no losers. I want to be clear. This is just for fun. Here in Morocco, this is the question, everybody. Here in Morocco, I being you, of course, am most entranced by the mountains, the coast, the food, or the historic cities. Make your choice. You'll see the results pop up on the app, on that little website I just directed you to. And when the final results are available, we'll do our best to show them to you here on the big screen. Now, without any further ado, it is time to get our program started. Please welcome to the stage Wamkele Mene, the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area. He's going to have a conversation with my colleague, Bloomberg's David Malinga.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is a session about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. It is a session about the history, the future, and the pride of Africa. And that's why we call it Pan-Africanism. And I want to start with a quote from one of the most celebrated Africans, Thomas Sankara, from the 1980s. He said, "Let's make the African market the market of Africans. Produce in Africa, transform in Africa, and consume in Africa. Let's produce what we need, and let's consume what we produce instead of importing." This is part of your mission at the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. Where are we in terms of implementing the agreement, in terms of cutting down the red tape, bringing down the borders, and seeing goods flowing through our borders seamlessly?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. If I may take a minute to contextualize what President Sankara was saying at that time, which was true then as it is today. of the character and the nature of Africa's economy, the African continent contributes to global GDP only 3.1%, 55 of us. Africa's contribution to global output and global trade is about 2%. If you consider a country like Singapore, whose contribution to global trade is at around 6%, 6.1%, clearly there's a deficit. And that deficit can be attributed to a number of factors: lack of industrial capacity, lack of economies of scale, smallness of national economies, market fragmentation, 42 currencies, not trading in a single African currency. So these are some of the constraints that have held back the productive capacity and competitiveness of our continent. In the wisdom of our heads of states, they have said this is not acceptable. We must do something about it. That is why 47 countries, as we speak, have ratified the agreement establishing the AfCFTA to establish a market of 1.3 billion people and to leverage on a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars. The trading under the AfCFTA has started. We see goods being moved from Ghana to Cameroon, from Egypt to West Africa. Trading under the rules of the AfCFTA started last year. And we will continue to see more and more countries making use of the preferential trade rules of the AfCFTA. It's not going to happen overnight. We also have adopted a number of instruments, legal instruments that are critical to consolidating a single market. Protocol on investment for investment protection. Protocol on competition policy. Protocol on intellectual property rights. And by July, we will conclude a protocol on digital trade and a protocol on women and youth in trade to address this question of inclusivity in trade. So we are starting from, we are 60 years behind, 60, 70 years behind. So the continent has a lot of catching up to do, but I believe that we are on the right track.
And this trading you talk about, Mr. SG, that you're doing, it's, you know, the testing of the rails that you're really laying. Are there any immediate lessons you've learned from what has happened so far with, you know, this trade we've seen, tea from Kenya coming to Ghana? Are there any lessons you've learned so far in terms of addressing the challenges?
Yes, some of the lessons we sort of knew already. For example, a big challenge of interconnectivity in Africa, a big challenge of trade supporting infrastructure to enable goods and services to seamlessly transit through borders, the need for, which is an absolute priority, the need for digitization of customs systems, which we've done at law. So we have a legal instrument that says all 47 of us must apply the same harmonized rules for transit, trade facilitation, and customs systems, but there's no interoperability. And this lack of interoperability of customs systems continues to be a constraint. So we are now considering and working with partners, how do we introduce a digital system for customs in Africa? The other exciting lesson which we've learned is that payments is at the heart of enhancing and boosting intra-Africa trade.
And I want to ask you about that because, I mean, this is a project, it's an initiative that Africans from all walks of life are proud of. But it's also an initiative that they all hope upon hope it works. Because the challenges are daunting. The currencies you speak about, for instance, the Kenyan president recently, Ruto, said he wants to see fewer and fewer trade transactions within Africa being settled in African currencies away from the dollar. And we've heard these songs before. The BRICS happening in South Africa have talked about reducing the dollar dominance, but it's really not worked. How are you going to deal with this?
Well, there's, at least in my view, the president is correct, absolutely correct. In my view, there's a political economy dimension, which we are all aware of. Then there is a dimension that is the impact of the cost of currency convertibility, the impact on small, medium enterprises, the impact on young entrepreneurs who want to trade across borders. If you have to, which we've done, you quantify the cost of currency convertibility for trade in Africa, it comes to $5 billion annually. The African continent in the year 2019, combined, our transactions on SWIFT were $19.5 billion. $19.5 billion worth of transactions. So that is a cost to the competitiveness of Africa's economy. So with Afrexim Bank, we have introduced the Pan-African Payments and Settlement System to enable trade in local currency. If you consider the fact that the 42 currencies in Africa, sometimes you are 5-10 kilometers from the border, and if you want to trade with a person across the border, you have to buy a third currency to enable trade. So we want to eliminate this by introducing a digital tool, which we've done, to enable payments for trade in Africa. Now, the question of a common currency, I believe, will come further down the line, because, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's massive challenges on macroeconomic convergence that you have to align across the 42 currencies. And goodness knows from the experience of the European Union that that's not an easy task. But in the interim, how do we address this challenge? And I believe that digitization, digital tools, present us with the opportunity to, at the very least, take a step forward to addressing this challenge of the cost.
What do you consider to be the biggest challenge to really, get us to a place where we say we are now moving, we're now building this biggest trading bloc in Africa? I mean, currency is just one of them, but there are several other challenges. Physical borders. I know up to now, there's some countries in Africa that don't have a physical border crossing. What do you consider to be the biggest challenge?
The infrastructure. Infrastructure that supports trade is the biggest challenge. Our senior brother, President Adesina of the AFDB, estimates the annual deficit, infrastructure deficit in Africa to be over $100 billion. But that over $100 billion is actually also an opportunity for investment. So it is a massive, significant challenge that we are confronting. And my fear is that we may succeed in establishing a very effective legal construct and a very effective legal foundation for trade liberalization and investment liberalization in Africa. But all of that will come to naught if the infrastructure deficit is not addressed, because you will need the goods to move somehow, and you will need to have good trade corridor connectivity, ports, trade corridors that connect countries that are landlocked to the ports. These are the challenges that we will have to contend with.
Yeah, and I just mentioned the quote from Thomas Sankara at the beginning. It's just part of the story. The other part is that you really also have to trade with the rest of the world, not just within Africa. How is that going, and where are the geopolitical tensions about decoupling, having a world where we have probably two trading blocs, one allied to China, one allied to the US? where does that leave Africa? One, and then two, I mean, do you have like real partner discussions with the rest of the world, with the European Union, with the US, the way Africa had with AGOA, anything but terms, etc.?
We have the trade pattern between the African continent and Europe, regrettably, has been that of Africa exporting unprocessed commodities. The AFCFTA seeks to change that. We have to export not only to Europe but to the rest of the world value-added manufactured production. That's going to take time, but we have taken the first step.
The aspiration is for you to do what China did.
The aspiration is for us to move beyond what China did and to be even more globally competitive than China. And I'll explain why and why I believe it's possible. If you take any mineral on the continent, let's take pharmaceuticals. Africa in 2019 imported $17 billion worth of pharmaceuticals. Copper that is exported from some parts of the continent, processed elsewhere, and exported back to Africa as a wiring harness to make a vehicle. We want to change that pattern. The conversations that we're having with our partners are very, very constructive. We, for example, have an MOU, a working constructive relationship with the United States Trade Representative, with the US Chamber. We have a working relationship with the government of the UK, of China. So we have a constructive dialogue with all our partners. What we have learned in the last 3 to 4 years, since we have been looking at the emergence of a new global architecture, the question is, how should Africa respond? And where should Africa position herself in this ever-changing, emerging global architecture, whether it's geopolitical considerations, geoeconomic, COVID-19, and the war, Russia, Ukraine. These are two lessons that, in my view, underscore and make a very compelling case for why the African continent should accelerate intra-Africa trade, intra-Africa investment. We can't disconnect from the global economy, and we should not, but the over-reliance on global supply chains, Africa's over-reliance on global supply chains is not good for Africa. I think you heard the Prime Minister state that. So the AFCFTA must enable Africa to establish continental supply chains without disconnecting from the global economy, must enable Africa to establish productive capacity. In 2020, in April 2020, one man, donated 7 million masks to an entire continent. Imagine that, because at that time, the global supply chains were so disrupted that Africa's capacity to produce or to import germ-killing products, tools that were required to fight the pandemic, were very, very limited. So we learned the lesson that we must accelerate self-sufficiency.
And during COVID, the other thing we really saw in Africa is the leapfrogging of payments, fintechs that you talked about.
Yes.
And you named several protocols. We don't have one on the digital economy yet, do we?
We will conclude the protocol on digital trade in July.
Okay.
That is a very important...
What is it going to do for us?
First of all, it establishes the right to market access in a digital economy. It establishes common disciplines across the 47 countries. It shall create a framework, a platform for payments. It shall create the ability of data to be moved across borders of the African continent. It really positions the African continent as a forward-looking new economic frontier where actually leapfrogging will be possible and should be possible because we don't have the legacy challenges as a continent. And so
I know we're running out of time, but I know you've been laying the rails, you started in the testing phase. When are we going to see the full commercial operations under the agreement fully take off?
It has, the operationalization has started, but it's a process. It's going to take a long time. Remember, the European Union was started 71, 72 years ago under the European Coal and Steel Pact, and it evolved into a single monetary union that we have today. So it takes time. Building a common market has challenges. It is daunting. It takes discipline. It takes focus. So it's going to take us a very long time.
There's a lot of goodwill. You're doing a lot of hard work. I think you're one of the most traveled Africans within Africans, doing a lot of stuff. Do you think Thomas Sankara and the other ancestors will be proud of how far you've come?
I hope that they can say that at least the first step has been taken. We have started the journey. We're not there yet. We've taken the very first important step towards integrating the market in Africa and creating a single market for goods, services, for trade, for investment, predictability and certainty, for intra-Africa investment, and also for other investors coming in from Africa, outside of Africa, to invest in what I believe 20 to 30 years' time will probably be the most competitive region in the world.
Mr. S. Kelly, thank you so much. Good luck, and we wish you all the best. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Please welcome our panelists, Minister of State in charge of Economic Planning of the Republic of Rwanda, the Honorable Dr. Claudine Uwera, Senior Director and Chief Executive Officer of AFC Capital Partners at the Africa Finance Corporation, Ayan Zainab Adam, Director General of the Société Générale des Travaux du Maroc, Hamza Kabbaj, and our moderator, Managing Editor of Africa of Bloomberg News, Arjit Ghosh.
So it's a very big topic. Let me start with a quote from an Indian politician who made a comment in 2017, and he said, "A rising tide doesn't raise people who don't have a boat. We have to build the boat for them. We have to give them the basic infrastructure to rise with the tide." So I think that kind of sums up why infrastructure is so key to development across the emerging world. But we still don't get enough investments, why is that? So that's the question for you in the room. You should probably see a QR code. The question for you is, what is the biggest obstacle to infrastructure development in Africa? Is it bureaucratic red tape, lack of funding, inadequate policy, or corruption? In case you don't see it behind you, it'll be behind me. You'll see it on your mobile phone. So please do vote and do let us know. I'll be able to see this on my iPad here. And we'll come back to that question as soon as you've all voted. But what we want to do right now is start off with some questions for the Minister here. Minister, thank you so much for joining us. The Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area just talked about the need for infrastructure to get the most out of this block, which could be the world's biggest. But we've seen some data coming. You know, the governments obviously have been investing, but they don't have enough funds. You know, we really need private capital coming into infrastructure. But if you see the latest data, private sector investment in infrastructure actually dropped almost 50% in Africa in the first half of 2022. That's the latest data. But it doubled, more than doubled in India and China. So there is money that's going to the right places. So, Minister, what can governments do on the continent to lure more non-state investment? What is missing?
Yeah, thank you very much, moderator. Thank you for highlighting this very important question. And the starting point, if I can say, is it was highlighted by the predecessor panelist. I can say that investments in modern infrastructure is really key. It's very key. And taking an example of the Africa continental free trade area, as it was highlighted by the panelists now, that's really expected to boost the intra-Africa trade by 52.3% by 2025, and they also to increase Africa income by $450 billion USD by 2035, and also, most importantly, to lift more than 30 million African people out of extreme poverty. We can say that even just to make it operational, it will be very, very key just to have adequate infrastructure that will ensure African continent that the free movement of people, capital, and goods is done as expected. So as you were highlighted, the financing gap is huge. If you try to see what's the African needs in terms of achieving the SDG-related infrastructure needs, Africa itself needs between 130 billion USD, between 130 and 170 billion every year in terms of infrastructure needs. But when you see the financing gap, you can understand that government itself cannot do everything itself, if I can say.
But what is
because
the government doing
to
lure investors?
Yes, exactly.
What is, let's say, Rwanda doing to lure investors?
Yeah, exactly. Just I come up to this point because the government itself, you know, with already the limited fiscal space with most of the African governments, we see that there is a need just to attract more private investment. The government of Rwanda has been really working toward achieving this target by putting a conducive and an ecosystem that really attracted the private investment just to come and support the government effort through the public-private partnership, for example. We have already so far established around 60 PPPs in different sectors in energy. We have in water, water generation, a number of things. Because we've seen that when it comes to the political will and the political commitment just to do so, private sector and the private investment come in because they need this conducive environment. They need, first of all, I say that we need to de-risk this sector just to make sure that at the same time we reduce the risk associated with project implementation. We also ensure the private sector that the profitability is there as well. So the government of Rwanda has been working in putting, first of all, a PPP framework, just to make sure that coordination is really well done. And the second, we try to go through policy reforms and establish tax incentives reforms. So to make sure that we have this environment that help the private sector just to come in. Of course, we still have a long way to go. This is why I just urge other African countries just to see all the challenges around, around the infrastructure sector needs, just to make sure that the private sector come in the appropriate way. Yeah. So and again, you know, in the early stage of development of project, this is where maybe part of the lesson learned. We've seen that not only we need to complete the projects just on time, something that most of the time doesn't happen as expected with the delay in the project implementation. So the early stage of development is also one of the key components that African country needs to focus on, because we've seen that when the design is not well done, when you don't have really good pipeline and bankable project with high impact, so you cannot expect the private sector to get interested in. So all those things, it's a complexity of things, but all need to be into a framework. Thank you.
So have you seen, do you want to emulate any country that has done well? Do you have any examples in your mind? Or how's your PPP looking in the sense? Is there a perfect model that you have found?
So we're trying to mimic other countries that are doing well. So our PPP framework also try to respect some standards to make sure that once we establish a PPP framework, so we follow that trend, especially for those countries that are doing well. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your answer. You did mention about failures of projects to actually be completed. Now, according to McKinsey, 90% of projects don't reach financial closure. And that's a question for you, ma'am. Why is that, and what is the solution?
Okay, so I think let's step back a little bit. I think I like the way you started. You talked about India and China getting more money than Africa. I happen to have with humility, I've lived in India investing 4 years and in Korea. So I think, and I want to link it with exactly the McKinsey work, which actually we had commissioned for a fund that we have started. When you look at Asia today, right, government, which has a fiscal, invests in the core infrastructure. And what I mean core infrastructure is they lay out the groundwork, they do the cable. I happen to have lived in a city called Songdo for 4 years. And that city is only 15 years old. And government laid out everything, and they spent 40 billion. But they're going to get back their 40 billion. Because what they did then is they invited companies, like the one I worked for, to have their offices there. They gave land, that's an incentive. And then people started moving in there. Companies started moving there. POSCO has an office, Samsung has an office, everyone has offices. People start coming. Then people pay taxes, right? Because they live in the city. The government benefits. So they have a horizon of, I think, 100 years to recover that investment. But their return is significant. They get up to 40% in that 100-year time frame. Because as people move in, as services get used, the government gets taxes. They also gave tax holidays to some of those companies to first come in. But they lay down the broadband and the infrastructure. I also lived in India, which struggled for a while and then got it right. And so let's look at Africa. I think what we have is our government are fiscally strained, and they're becoming more and more strained. They went through COVID. They barely survived, and then you had the food crisis. You have many governments that are just living day to day. So that the earnest of doing this kind of long-term planning and laying out the infrastructure that you need to industrialize, to get better value for your natural resources, to build your transport, and then we have a power deficit. So you're actually going to need not only the private sector, the public, and anyone else that has money to come into Africa. So the statistics that you have from McKinsey is that we have $2.3 trillion deficit in terms of infrastructure planning from 2020 to 2028, of which most of that is in the study and in the design stage. So my institution, Africa Finance Corporation, which is $11 billion infrastructure solutions provider, was created to really do that as an example. So we have created with the ability to do from cradle to grave. We are a public-private partnership. We're majority owned by private banks, African large banks, as well as some of the African pension funds. And then we have memberships from government, because in infrastructure, you need to de-risk the politics. So the membership of governments enables us to work with government and to de-risk these projects, get the policy framework in place. But the money that we have is mostly managed, mobilized from the African pension industry and African private banks. So how do we de-risk this? So I give you one example. In a country like Gabon, what they needed is that they were fully dependent on fossil fuel in oil. and the country is 80% forest. There was a lot of illegal logging, and there was no other industry of size. So we worked with the government, our partner, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, AFC, and an international player, Olam, and we put together an infrastructure industrial platform, which has diversified that economy from only being oil to supplier of high quality, sustainable, forest certified industrial zone. We've invited all the Chinese companies and others to produce it there. So with our partner Olam, ourselves and the government, we also built 2 ports, all the roads that connect, and then we put together the sustainable industrial park, which processes some of the natural resources of the country, both the rare metals as well as the sustainable timber to go abroad. But that required us to really not go to the country and say, this is the checklist that you need to get this going, but it's to say, okay, this is what we need to get this infrastructure in place, and that's the roads, the ports. We have a mineral port, we have a cargo port. It's managed very well. We have invited all the companies to produce the timber. The country's GDP has changed to have almost 15% to become a furniture manufacturer. So today when you go to Dubai or in Europe or others, you have furniture that has been made in this industrial park. So I think in terms of solution, we need to have an African approach to the problem. The problem, it can't be only one person. It's everybody working together. What did Gabon did? Gabon put very good policies. They put illegal logging. They supported the industrial parks. They gave tax holidays. So I'm just making it practical so we can see what's possible when private sector, government, and the right players come together to really change the ecosystem. So you have now better pricing for the minerals. You've built the infrastructure, the ports. You have put an industrial park which employs a lot of people, and you have changed the dynamics of that country. We're doing the same thing in Benin with cotton. We're building the port. We are now, our Benin, it was just a raw material producer. Today, you have stores in America that will have jeans from Benin. And we have, you know, kids' clothing. I think there is a, I forgot the name of the company because I don't have kids, but there is a kids' company that actually they just did their first supply. We're doing that with cashew nuts in parts of Ivory Coast. We're doing with agro-processing in Nigeria. So I think infrastructure in Africa cannot be looked at in isolation. It has to be looked at as supporting a major economic activity that can fund it. So that is how you're going to de-risk it. It's taking the solution, getting everybody to work together to meet the end goal.
So let me bring Hamza here right now. I mean, you are a massive construction company in Morocco. What Ms. Adams said, would you kind of go ahead and build projects with that comfort that everything is in order right now?
Very good question, thank you. In reality, Morocco is a great example in looking at that. If you look at what happened over the last 20 years in this country, it was also driven by a vision by our government, our leader, and our leaders to get to the point where we understand that infrastructure is not an investment which is short-term. Investment, if you look at Tangier Port, which was built 20 years ago, originally was looked at as a massive investment for this country, without even looking at the indirect investment that will be driven by such an investment. So Tangier Port 1 was built, and then it gave birth to Tangier Med 2 and 3 today, attracted and made Morocco one of the biggest platforms for automotive industry in the region. This would not have been possible without a long discussion and a collaboration between private and public sector. If you look at Morocco over the last 3 years, it's a perfect example on what happens and magic that can happen when these entities talk together. And the real word right now in Morocco is fast track. Everything was fast tracked, from construction, which we're responsible for, to financing, to government role. And it all starts with a vision. I mean, most of the time we say the biggest problem is financing. I think the biggest problem is vision. Once the government has a vision on what he needs and what he wants to do, he finds the financing. The private sector comes on board because it's reassured that those risks are de-risked. What we've done, as a clear examples, we have built a university in 7 months in Rabat during COVID, at the peak of the pandemic, because it was needed, and the collaboration between private and public sector was so effective that also the World Bank backed the project very quickly. So I don't think that financing by itself is a problem. It's the coordination of all these entities working together. We have right now a major problem of water stress in Morocco. We've been approached by the government in the beginning of this year, around the month of January, to fast-track the highway of water, meaning connecting a region which has potential water resources needed in another region. So we're building a pipeline of 70 kilometers in 8 months. How did we do that? The discussion came, and a lot of the questions came around, is the design going to be a problem? Is the construction going to be a problem? Is the financing going to be a problem? And putting together around the table the right parties, the right entities, enabled us to do for the first time what we call the project bond. So we raised the money to bridge loan the money needed to build a project in a month through pension funds and private sector in Morocco. Government backed up this decision by the construction contract, including financing, and we're delivering the project in the month of August. So we're talking about 80-kilometer pipeline of 3-meter diameter, moving millions of meter cubes of water. This would have been impossible without such a vision, with a channel of discussions and trust. Trust is a big issue. I mean, in a lot of projects, I mean, we're active around the continent in various countries. Probably trust is the first element that generates all these financial models to put risks, risk on constructions, risk on design, risk on financing. You add up all those risks, at the end of the day, you have no projects. Because that comes from the lack of trust and the lack also of understanding that the project itself will generate an added value to the government, to the private sector, to the different entities. And once this is driven by the right governance, by the right vision of our leaders, all the other problems have solutions. And I think that experience showed that this is possible in all different sectors. I mean, I spoke about education, I spoke about water, I can speak also about health. Morocco has decided last year to become independent in vaccine production, and decided to launch a vaccine factory in Morocco. Again, fast track. We've been involved, and we've built the vaccine factory in 12 months with the help of private banks that acted as the investors and operators, while the government was looking for a more long-term solution. So these discussions are all possible when the drive, the leadership, and the vision is clearly stated. And that eliminates a lot of the risks that are put by all the investors that make projects collapse or just disappear when we go from a good project to a project that never is being built, just because this combination of risks put together by the different parties, not looking at the big picture, which is what are we bringing to the table long term. And this takes us also to the problem that in some of the countries, politicians and political leaders have a short-term vision instead of being helped by higher entities to look at the long-term vision and what are we bringing to the country.
So, Minister, let me bring you here. I mean, there's a very good example that Hamza gave about the project bond and, you know, all the coordinations between everybody. Do you think governments like in Rwanda could actually do that and have successful projects in the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, I like that point. And when it comes to the financing instrument, innovative financing instrument, just we need to think in the long term. Because short-term projects have proven that those projects, most of the time, they don't have the high impact, and the expected economic return is really very low, taking into consideration all the effort that may have been put together just to implement those projects. This is why coming up with a financing instrument that's really target the long run and the long term is really very key. Yes, the government of Rwanda, this is something we've been doing. And when it comes to infrastructure development, we've seen that it's not only just to go through implementing all those projects in a routine way, because you've heard that recently Rwanda experienced some disasters that really caused loss and damages. And what we've learned from that, we've got this in 2018, in 2023 this year, recently. We've seen that investing in resilient infrastructure is really key, just to make sure that everything we do is done in a sustainable way. And this is why we have now been able to revise our national investment policy to make sure that the climate component is really well integrated. So which means that not only just we design those framework, but when it comes to this, just closing this finance gap by attracting the private investment as well, we need to make sure that when private investors come in, they really find those instruments really helping them just to invest exactly. You've heard again that during the last COP, the COP27, Rwanda launched what we call the IREME Invested. This is about a green investment facility that will help us just to close this gap by attracting the investors, and they help them just to get the financing from the green investment as well. So sustainability matters a lot for Rwanda, because, you know, on the part of on the planning side, we are implementing the sustainable development goals. And the SDG-related infrastructure require us to respond to these sustainability questions. So let's go ahead with those infrastructure development, but let's go ahead in a sustainable way. So having innovative financing instruments, but of course we need to analyze on the other side when it comes to government borrowing, the debt levels need to be controlled at the same time, coming up with concession loans, and so maybe the fiscal space might be limited, and they're rising the debt levels as well. So the private investment will always be needed, but governments need to ensure, to make sure that they have this capacity to guarantee the private sector that once they come on board, so everything has been created just to, so, and again, just to come up to what my predecessor says. So it's not only government itself, it's not the private sector itself, but it's all of us, just we need to work together. And again, something that was not mentioned in this discussion. When it comes to private investment funds, so to be able to bridge this gap, resources are available. But when it comes to the flow of resources from maybe developed country to developing countries, we don't see it happening as expected. For example, we have a sovereign wealth fund, we have pension funds around 2 trillion in Africa, and out of Africa, we also know that there is more and more. So why cannot we maybe put all our efforts together, Africa and the other countries, just to make sure that infrastructure development is really done in an expected way? Thank you.
And one more question actually on financing, and since we are spending a lot of time on that, development finance institutions work at a glacial pace, right? And they take ages to kind of, provide funding and everything. So what do they need to do to change, ma'am, for you actually, Ms. Adams? What do they need to change to kind of be faster? Because Africa is the youngest continent and they really need progress now.
So I think, we are a private sector DFI, so we have to be faster and we have to deliver projects on time. We are an investment grade institution. We are the second or the third highest. So for us, we can't waste time. But actually, it's the ownership of the problem. You need to live in this continent to realize, and most of our money is African money. So we don't have those kind of hangs up about the perception of risk. So even Moody's published a report just before COVID, which showed the default rates of all the region. Middle East was #1, Africa was #2 in terms of lowest default rates. So there's this perception of risk that's overblown and over-exaggerated. We do have risks in terms of currency, in terms of other factors, which are inherent in our projects, but it's not a default rate, because most of our governments are paying through their nose to guarantees most of these PPA. There may be delays, there may be some restructuring because of a macro event, but in general, most of our projects have the second lowest default rates in the world. So there is that. So I think for us, it's more is Africa taking ownership of its this is our last mile financing. So I have been working in this space for a very long time. I've worked for many different DFIs, and there was a time where Africa didn't have a very well-developed banking sector. We cannot say that anymore. Africa has a pretty solid banking industry. We've had general private equity come in. I think the last mile financing is our really infrastructure which will enable industrialization and value capture for our resources. And that's why, for me, this is the sector that is going to need us to think outside of the box and to go with the attitude, I want to make this project happen. Unfortunately, a lot of DFIs are not that connected. So they're not development, but they are also look like private sector, and their systems are very burdensome with significant amount of red tape that makes it very difficult for them to really be nimble in coming up with the approach. And hence, an institution like ours, we've put now $10 billion in a matter of just 12 years. It's because there is absence. Our pipeline is much bigger. We still haven't received much foreign investment. But the reality is, if you have the willingness and are able to come to the table quickly, the governments do listen. They do change regulation. They don't want to change things and then I'll come 5 years from now. So a huge part of our success is the fact that we get things done, right? And we get things done on time. And the governments that we've worked with have played along to support us in putting together the right legal and regulatory framework to make that particular PPA work.
We're running out of time, so 20 seconds each. What is the most important thing for Africa to create jobs and be inclusive? I mean, is it energy, electricity, water? What is the most important infrastructure? Hamza, let me start with you.
Well, I think it's a combination. There's not one that can solve the issue. It's a combination of having the right resources at the right time. And I think time to market is a big issue. I mean, we have all this vision of what we need. We need to be able to deliver it as fast as possible and make sure that we lay the foundations of the next generations, finding and arriving on an Africa that has all what it needs to be up to the standards, up to the level of living, up to the level of business doing in the world as an integrated continent.
Infrastructure, I would say, and infrastructure broadly. I think we need to invest in our education infrastructure, our health infrastructure, our roads, our transport infrastructure, our power infrastructure. We also need to really integrate climate elements into the entire ecosystem, not just the agriculture, but resilient infrastructure. So you need infrastructure and it's all interconnected. Skills development, skills training, and we need to also invest in partnership infrastructure to get the continent to where it should be.
Minister.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think investment in infrastructure is really key, and nothing else can accelerate intra-Africa trade and the economic growth without more than infrastructure. So I think as it was highlighted, it's a combination of things. We need the financing, we need the resources, we need commitment, government commitment, we need the private sector commitment. We need to make sure that infrastructure is done in priority number in different sectors, starting by, education, in the health sector. We need to make sure that both the rural and the urban area, are balanced when it comes to the basic need in terms of infrastructure, even just to make sure that it's also, it impact on other sectors of the economy, agriculture, for example, and so. So I think it's a combination, it's a complexity, but let's all of us get committed, and let's our government also take the lead just to ensure, the ownership and something else. This political stability is also key when it comes to regional infrastructure. It doesn't mean that if one country is really willing to do, the other country, if is not creating the working environment, it will not be leading to the expected target. So it's all of us, it's a combination of things and a strong commitment to any stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's been fantastic. It's an massive topic. We could go on, but thank you, everybody. Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome to the stage Executive Chairman of Fortescue, Andrew Forrest, and our moderator, Eric Schatzker.
Thank you, sir. Hello again, everyone. This is Andrew Forrest. Andrew, there are people here, believe it or not, who don't know who you are and why you're here. And I think we can frame it for them quite effectively with this question. You've staked your company, you've staked your reputation, you've been staked a significant part of your fortune on green hydrogen. Why?
Okay, I think it's because I share a global community of scientists who are, like me, ecologists or atmospheric scientists, and they've seen that we've been kind of buffered from global warming over the last several years. You might not think, ladies and gentlemen, that we have, because you've had the worst atmospheric or climate-driven disasters yet ever. But over that period of time, we've had El Nino. It's a cooling impact. We've switched from El Nino to El Nino this year.
From La Nina to El Nino.
Exactly. Much better pronunciation. You're clearly not Australian. That means that the planet's warming much quicker than IPCC or anyone predicted. And we stand at very real risk now of 1.5 degrees atmospheric warming next year. And that will change.
This is the amount of warming we're trying to prevent by 2050.
By 2050, could hit us between the eyes next year.
So you are motivated by a desire to effectively fix what we've done, to reverse the damage that we've done to the climate.
Yeah, I think, and to not blame consumers, to stop saying, oh, it's consumers throwing plastic in the ocean, it's consumers who are burning the carbon. No, it's not. It's those countries and those manufacturing centres who are allowing consumers to only have one choice, pollute the planet. And we have to change. Industry and governments must change so we give consumers the choice to not pollute the planet, and we know what they're going to choose. Don't destroy the planet. But right now, we're going headlong into climate disaster.
Okay, it's a compelling point that you make, and if you're right, that this warming of the planet could be upon us much, much sooner than 2050, it may in fact be here already. Why isn't anyone else, Andrew, evangelizing the virtues of green hydrogen as urgently as you are?
Look, I just don't know if there's too many doctorates in ecology at the top end of global business. That may be a reason.
We both know there are not.
Okay, that may be a reason, and also that chief executives like to have real cracks at politicians, but I can tell you they're motivated by the same thing, short-termism. And I think chief executives now must step up around the world to realise that, yes, it might impact their 1 year or 5 year bonus, but if they don't shift their companies towards green, to LNG as crossover fuel to green hydrogen, and everything else, green electrons, green electricity, then they will go down in history for all the wrong reasons, that they willfully ignored the very real signs of climate change being upon us. It's not a prediction anymore, Eric. We're living in it. I mean, what's happening in your own state? I mean, I'm not sure where you're from, but...
I live in New York City.
Well, just tell us what happened there. I mean,
for those of you who haven't seen the headlines, we've been shrouded in smoke for the past 10 days.
Oh, how often
Smoke
does
is
that
coming from wildfires north of the border in Canada, and yes, it appears to be a consequence of climate change.
Yeah, we had our worst fires ever in Australia. It covered Sydney in smoke.
Andrew, I know one of the reasons you're here in Marrakesh and in Africa because you see the enormous potential this continent has as a source of renewable power for electrolysis, right? That's the process by which hydrogen is extracted from water. Tell us about Africa's potential.
Africa's potential is the best in the world, and it's Africa's shot now. It's Africa's turn. What will stop Africa rightfully taking its turn will be lack of progress on technology. Companies and governments around the world choose Fortescue because we are the world leaders in technology, world leaders in next era electrolyzer design, cables, solar, all the tech which is moving our world on from having to rely on dinosaur era fossil deposits of oil, coal and gas to simply today's era of machines which make machines to harness all that beautiful renewable energy and give all the mobile energy, all the fixed energy this world could ever need by many times. Those countries who resist that are denying Africa their opportunity. And I'm saying, stop it. Let's get in behind Africa. We go to countries where the presidents or their officers invite us to go. They say, look, if we want to go green hydrogen or green metals, there's one company in the world who's doing it. Would you come to our country? And that's why we are delighted to be here in Africa as technology leaders and leaders in climate thought and leaders in rapid industrial development. I just want to give you one example. The Gabonese president invited us in to develop a project which others had sat on for 40 years.
Where's this, I'm sorry?
In Gabon.
Gabon.
And down the road there's another big deposit where a mining convention was granted 4 decades ago. Nothing's happened. We were granted our mining convention in February in less than, not 4 decades, less than 4 months. We had first ore on the pad next to the ship. So this is the speed which Fortescue moves at, not because we're a huge company, but because we run ourselves like a small family.
So Africa, in your words, has the best green hydrogen potential of any region in the world. Better than your home country, Australia? Better than Chile, for example? Better than the Gulf states like Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, I'm comfortable to say that. I'm absolutely putting that stake in the ground. And if it doesn't get developed, it's because of lack of maybe local leadership, but lack of global support. I see, say, here in Morocco, really great leadership. Now let's get in behind Morocco to develop their resources. Let's have Morocco invite in the best technologists like us in the world to get the job done.
How on earth is Africa supposed to compete with the billions upon billions of dollars in subsidies and incentives that the US government is handing out in the Inflation Reduction Act? How?
Okay, so quite simply, it's called energy efficiency. I'm going to need 3 or 4 times the number of solar panels and huge subsidies to what I could develop wind and solar here in Morocco, because the wind intensity, the quality and radiance is much higher here than anywhere in North America. And by the way, we're on the doorstep of Europe, who's begging for green hydrogen and green electrons, and Fortescue's saying, we can build the cables you need straight across the pond. We can supply green hydrogen. Let's get going.
One more question for you about the IRA. Is it good policy?
No, it's excellent policy. I think those people in the Democratic Party who were brave enough to push it forward, those Republicans who didn't stand in the road, will be seen as heroes. Those countries who bellyache about it, complain about it, I'd say, get off your tail. This is the policies which every country should adopt. And if you say, well, hang on, can African countries adopt it? No, not on their balance sheet, but on ours they can. This is a very good economic decision. I explained to President Biden in his office, if you back this in, it will repay itself every 3 to 5 years in economic growth and taxes. That's a fantastic investment. You do it all day as an investor. Couldn't get enough. That's what the IRA is. It's great for countries. Economic growth is green growth. The IRA just set the example for the rest of the world. And we have the International Development Bank, we have the IFC, we have the World Bank, we have all these multilateral institutions who are waiting to invest in Africa, and let's now give them the opportunity and demand that they do.
Let's talk for a moment about cost. Solar and wind are viable sources of electricity now because they're cheaper than coal.
Well,
green hydrogen
anything, actually
isn't exactly cheap yet, is it?
No, but look, we have the largest renewable energy company in Australia, and I was speaking to a very well-known leader yesterday. It will become the largest energy company in Australia, not oil, coal,
Your
gas.
company.
A renewable energy company will become the largest because during that rapid build-out of green hydrogen, it will have firming power, keeps the lights on during dinner in Kenya, with natural gas. Okay, that's what we will do. But we'll also go metal to the wall with green hydrogen because that must replace it.
The U.S. Department of Energy has set a target for the end of the decade, $1 a kilogram for green hydrogen. Is that a realistic objective?
Look, we're fairly accused of being the leading technologists in the world. A lot of people talk this game, but we have major technology centres all over the world. And I see the trend. It's a lot higher now, but I can see the trend. As a long-term investor, long-term technologist, I see that trend.
To what, though? Are we going to get to $1 a kilogram, subsidy-free by 2030?
Look, I think 2030 is hard. Don't say that I'm saying it's impossible. I've never done anything easy, right? I'm just saying to you it's hard.
What about the other barrier to adoption? When companies and countries evaluate sources of energy, efficiency is part of that equation. And there's currently a lot of wasted energy in the conversion process. If you're losing more than half the electricity you put into electrolysis, is it a viable alternative to some of those fossil fuels?
Yeah, I mean, have you heard of oil? Have you heard of gas? I mean, you convert oil out of the ground, refine it, turn it to diesel, whatever you like, which is going to cook the planet. You've already lost 60 to 70%. I mean, yes, there is a conversion loss from not losing an electron going from wind and solar straight into the grid. That's why it's the lowest cost energy in the world. But there's a conversion loss. Oh my God, a conversion loss. The oil and gas sector, green hydrogen's got a conversion loss. It's like putting lipstick on a pig from the oil and gas sector. They have had a conversion loss since 1810, right? And remember, relative dollars, their dollar per barrel was $1,600. Let's not forget that. That's how they got going. Subsidies, $1,600. Wow, it's better than burning wood. Now the same companies stand in the road of green hydrogen and say, oh my God, it's not as efficient as us. We've only had a 200-year head start. Hundreds of trillions of subsidies, which we've swallowed from taxpayers. They should get none, and they want to do it in 8 or 9 years. Who would you back? I'd back us.
Andrew, Elon Musk is an influential voice in the renewable energy discussion.
No, he's an influential voice in batteries.
Well, I was about to say, he's dismissive of green hydrogen and all in on batteries. Why is that?
He's a lovely commercial animal. Right? I mean, battery fuel cells are the way of the world in the future because you can top up a little tank with hydrogen, you've got a battery, a way to go. But he doesn't have that economic model. He's just all batteries. He's in a bit earlier, but he's trying to make sure, a bit like carbon sequestration, that the next idiot comes along believes him. Right? But actually, hydrogen fuel cells, which needs a battery too, and I'm a huge investor in batteries. We have the leading battery technology right now, leading battery intelligence right now. I'm happy to unpack this with you as much as you like. So I'm a huge believer in batteries, but any muppet who says hydrogen doesn't have a role is a muppet.
Just to make sure that everybody got that.
That's a Muppet show on stage.
Elon is the Muppet?
I'm saying anyone, including Elon, including, you know, whoever you like, who says hydrogen hasn't got a massive future, are muppets.
Let's go back to Africa. How much are you prepared to invest in this continent?
Tens of billions.
Over what period of time?
Well, I'm opportunity driven, right? So, you know, I have a...
If the opportunities were here right now, would you invest that much money in the next 24 months?
Yeah, right now. Yeah, look at Kenya, right? I mean, what I love about North Africa most is that it's full of smart people. So Kenya, they're wasting truckloads of steam. We're going to convert that steam to green electricity, green hydrogen, fertilizer. Right? We want to do that across Africa. Green fertilizer is the way of the world, and all that wasted energy can make this beautiful region never worry about food shortages, scarcity again.
I'm sure you're finding, however, that even in the most advanced African economies, this place can be a challenging one in which to do business. What do you need to see before you're prepared to commit capital?
Leadership, decisiveness, people who, and government leaders, corporate leaders who are prepared to go from MOUs, I'm not a fan of MOUs, we'll sign them if we have to binding agreements. I mean, I can't bank an MOU, I can't finance an MOU. We're a huge public company, we might be run like a little family, but we have very strict governance. So there's only a few places in the world where we'll commit millions of dollars without a binding agreement. Now, I'm doing that all over Africa because I'm giving people time. And we're just investing in the faith of the good character of the people we're dealing with. But I would like to say, take the DRC. We were there when no one was there, at the start of COVID, right? When there was we had to take our own testing machine. There was no vaccines, there was no tests. We had to do it all ourselves. We went there and we made a proposal to develop Groundinga. Now, I'd have to say, if ink doesn't go on that contract this year, then we have to inform the President that there's too many other countries, say like this magnificent country, who demand our technology, demand our capital, and which we have to pay attention to.
Have you delivered that message yet?
You know,
Or did you just deliver it?
I just delivered it.
Andrew, I was in Qatar recently, and when I was there, I heard the Saudi Energy Minister, Abdulaziz bin Salman. Now, for those of you who don't know, Saudi Arabia is a bit complicated. It is, of course, the pivotal oil producer in OPEC, but it also claims to be building the largest utility-scale green hydrogen project in the world, in the far north of the country, in the city of Neom, that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is behind. Now, somewhat like Elon, ABS, Abdulaziz bin Salman, was critical of green hydrogen, which he did call it the cleanest of clean fuels, but he said what investors demand, and you're an investor, is long-term certainty. And he says in green hydrogen there is no certainty, and I'm going to quote him directly. I ask you, who is going to be the off-taker, and what will the price be? There are no clear policies for the off-takers. How do you respond to that?
I'd say, and where do you make your income? Oh, oil, gas. I'd be throwing as many screwdrivers into that gearbox as I could. And that's all that's happening there. I mean, massive vested interest, massive, look, technology will eventually get there. In the meantime, we've got to have economic growth at all costs. I can tell you the cost, it's going to be the planet. So yeah, I'm very used to those arguments. I'd say, look, London was going to be destroyed with horse manure. They didn't know how to get rid of horse manure, right? Then the engine came along. Before that, we used slaves instead of wheels to build the pyramids. Okay, now we're going to green hydrogen, and there's going to be massive resistance from those who are locked into their current income streams. They'll give you lots of public signals, but I always believe trust a person generally pretty well for what they say, but completely what they do. And we are fully committed to stopping this world cooking. And if you take that little excuse trotted out by that little oil company, right, that we should be careful here, investors want certainty, blah, 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 well, I can tell you, mate, you got there because someone else took risk on oil. And we save our planet because people are taking risks on green hydrogen.
Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew Forrest.
Thank you.
Folks, we're going to return in 30 minutes, so set your timers for noon approximately, after a brief coffee break. With clean energy, the business of sports, enjoy the break. See you back in 30 minutes.
When the chimes end, just try, 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 just try. Chimes in. Just try, 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 chimes in. Just try, 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 just try,
Please take your seats. Our program will resume shortly. Please take your seats. Our program will resume shortly. Please take your seats. Our program will resume shortly. Please make your way back to the plenary. The show will begin soon. Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seat. The program will now begin.
So we're going to go for the poll.
Please welcome our panelists, Chief Executive Officer of Africa 50, Alain Ebobisse, and our moderator, Managing Editor of Africa of Bloomberg News, Arjit Ghosh.
So, Issa, you've been with IFC for 18 years. Now you're running Africa 50. What's the difference between the two?
All right, thank you. Let me just first thank the organizer for inviting me. We're very pleased to be here. I also want to acknowledge my partners from the government of Morocco here who are hosting Africa 50. Well, what is different between my stint at IFC and Africa 50? First of all, it's because at Africa 50 we have the ability really to operate in a way which is a bit more flexible, and also in a way that allows us to, I would argue, to speed up the implementation of a project to some extent. At the same time, we have our balance sheet is much smaller, so we still need the IFCs and the African Development Bank and the World Bank of the world. But we believe at Africa 50 that we can show the way in terms of speed and execution.
So on that point of showing the way, we had a column out today by our Bloomberg opinion columnist, Lara Williams, who wrote a piece saying that, Africa can become a climate savior instead of being typecast as a victim all the time. So what are the ingredients required for us to kind of do that in Africa?
Well, look, first of all, let me just say that, and this is something that, most people know, Africa's contribution to climate change is quite low. And yet, the continent is admittedly suffering the most in terms of global warming and climate change. Now, the good news for us is that our leaders and also the businesses in Africa and the population, we are fully aware of this, and we are fully committed to doing our part towards meeting our climate goals. But what we're also saying is that we want to make sure that the transition to net zero is a just and equitable transition. Now, we have lots of resources. If you take the power sector, for example, the energy sector, and I was quite pleased by the conversation we heard earlier by Fortescue on hydrogen, green hydrogen. We have quite a bit of resources, renewable resources, and we need to make sure that we're able to tap those renewable resources to produce renewable power. And we are already doing that to some extent. We need to talk about the successes that we have. If you take Morocco, for example, the Ouarzazate Nour solar program, but also wind, quite, a number of power plants here are renewables in Morocco. If you look at Egypt, for example, with the Bemban 1.5 gigawatt solar plant in Bemban, which Africa 50, my company, invested in 400 megawatt there. So quite a bit is done, but we need to do a lot more and faster, and that's our challenge. But the good news is that we know how to do these things, and we have to figure out a way to do them faster and then at a bigger scale.
So are you seeing, do you have any country that you can emulate and bring technology or bring the right processes into Africa?
Well, look, I think one of the things that will make a big difference, and I could pick it up from the conversation we had earlier, it's about implementation speed. And we need to look at how other countries, other regions have done it. And, at Africa 50, we work quite a bit with friends from India. We have partnerships with Power Grid of India, for example, to develop transmission line PPP in Africa. And, in India, but also in some of the other emerging regions, they have been able to speed up implementation. In the space of infrastructure, green infrastructure, where we operate at Africa 50, it is not rocket science, those projects. Those projects, we know how to do them. And I think with a few elements, some of them difficult, like mindset change, we can do things a bit faster. At Africa 50, the company that I lead, we've been able to invest in over 22 projects in 5 years in Africa, infrastructure projects in Africa, in 16 countries, while building the organization, just to demonstrate that the speed of execution is possible without compromising on the quality. Our mantra at Africa 50 is, if it's good enough, do it. Don't wait for perfection. Because sometimes people spend way too much time to get a perfect project, and they forget about the opportunity cost of delayed project implementation. If it's good enough, you do it, you can correct course, and with that kind of mindset, I believe we will see a substantial pickup in the investment in infrastructure, green infrastructure in Africa.
You talked about Power Grid Corp of India, and I'm glad to hear that they are doing things speedily. It's a state-run company. Can you tell us more? How much investments are you seeing because of that?
Well, I just mentioned the example with Power Grid for India because we're looking at transmission PPP in Africa. In fact, we will be the first entity to develop massive transmission public-private partnership on the continent. We'll do it in Kenya. Many other countries are approaching us. Hopefully, in Morocco, we're also going to look at that. My friends, Minister Jazuri is here, Minister Benali is also here. We're having those discussions. So transmission PPP is one of the areas. But the speed that we want to see has to start at the early stage of the project development, the project preparation of the project. See, you mentioned earlier a statistic from McKinsey that a lot of projects fail at the project development phase. What we don't have enough on this continent is enough project preparation and project development resources. We need to build up the pipeline of bankable projects that could receive funds from investors which are seeking a good asset, good project which have been developed, but those investors are reluctant to come in the early stages. This is one of the reasons why Africa 50, together with the African Development Bank and the African Union Commission, we have launched the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa that will seek to raise $500 million of project preparation and project development to generate $10 billion worth of green infrastructure assets. These are the kind of initiatives that our continent needs, while we continue to argue forcefully for the $100 billion that developed countries actually have promised to developing countries for climate financing. We will continue to forcefully argue for that. We also need to take our own initiative on this continent to do what we have to do to get to the net zero.
You talked about some successes, which is fantastic, but you talked about the Green Infrastructure Alliance as well, which was formed in COP27, if I'm not mistaken, last year. Where are we now? What are the challenges you are facing to kind of raise this 500 million right now?
Yeah, no, look, I think, and this is really something that we need to crack. It's easier when you have a bankable project to raise money from investors. In fact, sometimes they fight to get a piece of the deal. There are very few investors, very few developers willing to come in the early stage to take the risk to develop the project. So it's not easy to raise $500 million for project preparation and project development. At Africa 50, we have about $100 million today for project development and project preparation. We need to multiply it by 5. So we are working on it. Stay tuned at COP28. We will make an announcement. In fact, next week in Paris at the summit that President Macron is organizing, we will talk about an important milestone for the Alliance for Green Infrastructure in Africa. And then at COP28, we hope to achieve a first close for this fund. But here's also the other thing that we should say. There is quite a bit of money in Africa managed by African insurance investors. The African Development Bank estimates that about $2 trillion of assets under management by African insurance investors. We need to figure out a way to tap some of those funds. We need to have a dual approach, seek partners, global partners to support us, but also do it with our own resources, local resources, regional resources. This is one of the reasons why Africa 50 has launched the Africa 50 Infrastructure Acceleration Fund, which we plan to announce, not we hope, we plan to announce soon. Stay tuned also for that.
Can you give us a sneak peek of this and the other one? It'll be fantastic to hear. A little more.
I think you'll be the first one to know when we are ready to announce. But in the event, it will be a $500 million fund that will seek to raise most of the money from African investors. We need to demonstrate that Africa is in the driving seat, working with partners, but it is us. We need to take over the matters because, you know, I spent sometimes 18 years at the World Bank Group, of course, and we will, you know, advise and recommend things to African countries, which is fine. It has to be done. But more and more, we have to see, and we see that Africans defining what they want to do and seek partners. Those that are not willing to work with us, that's fine. We will still proceed. But for that, we need to mobilize our own resources.
We're running out of time. In 20 seconds, what keeps you awake at night?
We want to do a lot more, a lot faster. The sense of urgency. There are about 15 to 20 million Africans, young Africans, getting into the workforce every year. We need to figure out a way to give them good jobs. And power, transport, these are things that keeps me away. We need to deliver a lot of infrastructure so that the economy will grow. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was brilliant.
Please welcome our panelists, Minister of Energy Transition and Sustainable Development of the Kingdom of Morocco, Her Excellency Leila Ben Ali, Chief Technology Officer of Gas Power, Europe, Middle East and Africa, part of GE Vernova, Othman Ben Omar, Chief Executive Officer of All On, Caroline Ebumbu, Managing Director and Lead Portfolio Manager of Impact Investments and Allianz Global Investors, Martin Ewald, and our moderator, reporter at Bloomberg News, Anthony Squazine.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're here to discuss clean energy. We'll take a seat. Really just looking at Africa and looking at the resources we have. We have some of the world's best solar resources, a lot of wind resources. Yet last year we saw investment in the sector slump to a 10-year low. Sorry, not last year, in 2021. So we're going to look at why that's the case, what strategies we can employ to reverse that, the role of fossil fuels, why it's so hard to attract investment in fossil fuel projects going forward, and then just looking at the future as well, green hydrogen and what other options we may have. We'd like some audience participation, so if you'd like to ask questions, please do use the QR code, and I'll be able to see your questions right here, and we'll hopefully have some audience interaction. Anyway, to get things started, we're going to start with the Minister, and I'd like you just to speak about the renewable energy sector, what the challenges are in getting investment, and what Africa needs to do, Morocco as well as the whole continent.
Thanks, Anthony. I think it's a great question because, as you heard in the earlier panels and the earlier discussions, Africa might have the best potential in terms of renewable wind, solar storage. I know that there are some battery players in the room, but at the same time, it's really challenging to attract those investments because there is a need to get a pipeline of bankable projects that will be doable. And the other issue that I think is being faced now is really the grid. Now we are in that situation where after years of underinvestment in the grids worldwide, but of course in Africa took a toll in those decrease in investment. So if I take the example of Morocco, we've been quite far in our electrification program. We have more than 99.8% of our population that is electrified. However, we are now facing that issue of the last mile and the quality of service that you provide first to the last 10%. And of course, those 0.2% that are left are the most frustrated, the poorest, and they want to have access to this sort of energy. So the traditional model of building large plants, renewables or others, and linking them to a grid that has suffered from years of underinvestment just doesn't work. And we have that conviction now in Morocco that we need to build in agile business models to enable the investors that are, of course, very happy to come invest in Morocco, to have that pipeline of projects with different sizes, with, of course, the guarantee, of course, to be able to either inject into the grid or to create an ecosystem of mini-grids in those decentralized areas. So this is, in a nutshell, how we are tackling the electrification challenge that Morocco and other countries in Africa are facing.
Great. Martin, perhaps I can ask you, you work in the finance industry. What needs to be done, and what are the solutions to getting enough finance onto the continent to make the energy transition happen?
I think it starts with the acknowledgement, like, to create an environment for institutional investors, and therefore also it's great to hear the Minister explaining how that is done. And then the next steps will be like, how can we really physically mobilize institutional capital? And this is what we try to do by bringing that in from Europe, and we need to acknowledge that especially renewable energy investments, long-term investments require long-term cash yields, a given level of return. That is something we try to bridge by building blended finance solutions. So we sit in an asset management company, Allianz Global Investors, and we build funds which enable us to provide equity for such projects on the ground. So we are financing local teams on the ground, really capable of building the required infrastructure. And the way we do that is we de-risk on fund level using public money in Germany, for example. So the German government, for example, gives us a first loss provision, which allows us to de-risk the portfolio we're investing into, and that in turn enables us to use institutional capital, like life insurance money from Europe, as in this case Germany, to flow into Africa, and the long run to catalyze change, because we don't believe it's good enough to just pick a single asset. We need to build an ecosystem, and that then should really create further growth.
Right. And Othman, is there a role for fossil fuels like gas? I mean, there's a lot of talk about it being a transition fuel, but there are a lot of opponents of fossil fuel in any form. What role does the fuel play?
The gas is really important to support the energy transition because all the renewables simply need stable power generation to deal with the intermittency. Additionally, when you look at a continent like Africa, some countries have natural resources that supports hydropower or wind or solar, but others have also fossil fuels. That's what will help them really start their energy transition, because with the sale of the gas and the exploration of the gas, they can start their energy transition. So definitely we need to make sure that we have power that gets to the consumer, to the industrial, when there is no sun, when there is no wind. And this is not on, we've seen challenges even in advanced countries where they had to go for fossil fuels even between season and season. I look at the numbers for 5 major important countries in Europe. In the year of 2021, there was a reduction into wind production of 7%. And luckily, they had assets to support that. So it's not only from a day to day which you can solve with batteries. So there is also seasonal aspect. And there is also with the climate change, unfortunately, we've seen also droughts in Europe, for example, that affected substantially the production of hydro. And we need to make sure, as we're doing this transition in Africa, we learn from those lessons and we build a resilient grid. And we also need, in a lot of countries, to provide the affordable power, and in a lot of cases, that affordable power is natural gas.
Right. And Caroline, perhaps I can come to you. We've spoken a lot about renewable energy. We normally talk about utility scale plants that are connected to the grid. With your background, you've looked at a lot of projects where people aren't connected to the grid. What are the options and how do we finance those?
Indeed. Grid connection is still a challenge in many of our countries with regards to
how far transmission lines have been extended. So what do we do in the meantime? Because it's clear, the data is there, and shows that when it comes to electricity access, 80% of the people in rural areas are best served through off-grid and DREs, decentralized renewable energy solutions. So it's key when we look at reaching our goals when it comes to universal energy access to ensure that we have a multi-pronged approach and not only look at developing the grids and strengthening the utilities, which is very important, but it has to be done in parallel of the efforts in the decentralized renewable solutions of grid. What are we talking about? Mini grids, solar home systems, name it. There are many alternatives that are already providing energy access to population who would not have access to electricity without those solutions. So the solutions are out there, but what's still missing? If we want to get to scale in the mini-grid sector, off-grid sector in general, one imperative is to look at the cost. Cost is still an obstacle. Cost of capital for providers of mini-grids and other DREs in the sector is still a deterrent. Especially, again, we talk about Africa, accessing debt is done at very high, the double-digit numbers for the providers in this sector, and it's just not sustainable. Not only cost of capital, but also what type of capital. Because we do have some initiatives where you have some debt available, but now equity is also lacking. So we do have to have providers who are in the sector providing equity. One last thing I would say on the very topic is the fact that as much as ultimately we want an off-grid sector that will be free of subsidies, for now it is still a reality that because it's a nascent sector, the off-grid sector needs a subsidy. And there are some good mechanisms out there. There are some facilities that do result-based financing and others, and we need to consider how these are still strengthened so that over time, yes, we will phase out subsidy, but we will support this nascent sector with this much-needed capital for now.
Martin, just on that point, these mini-grid projects, these off-grid projects, is that something that you see the private sector being interested in? Or do you think all the money is really flowing to the bigger projects?
Interest, totally interest, yes, I think that's for sure. But on the other hand, like you also have to take into account the realities of an institutional investor, and that's like also the fiduciary duty one has. And then depending on where the money comes from, it's very hard to invest because like you have it's very hard to run a physical due diligence. So people like me who have to take a decision, you need like a certain size to really be able to properly evaluate. I think that's one of the points. On the other hand, it is something where we really see decentralized energy production will be important for future reference. And maybe just like really to pick up on the type of capital, equity is really exactly there needed because you can't properly bank on that. So you really need to finance it with equity, and that needs to grow. And this catalytic role, I think, if I were to have one wish to the political agenda, is like to differentiate a bit more in what kind of capital should be mobilized. Should not be about like the trillions, whatever. It should be equity, catalytic, and then the political agenda should, especially in Europe, also should differentiate a bit what is flowing when. And this is one of the examples where we can really see how important equity will be in the equation.
Okay, and just turning back to the grid. Where I'm based in South Africa, the biggest impediment is the grid. It's not strong enough, and therefore you cannot add renewable energy in the places where it's most easily produced. The arid areas of the country, but obviously economically not as active as other areas. Is it a big impediment, Minister, across Africa? And here in Morocco and elsewhere, is it a big impediment to the strength of the grid?
It is more than an impediment. It's really a requirement to invest in it. I mean, last week I announced in Parliament that we need to invest roughly between $1 and $2.5 billion per year. And a large chunk of that is going into reinforcing the grid to enable the penetration of renewables down the road. My issue with that is, it's not the amount that is an issue. And if you allow me for a second, I'll put my hat of President of United Nations Assembly for the Environment that Morocco has the privilege of chairing until next year. The issue today is not to have the numbers to add up. It's really that flow of investment that has to go, especially when it comes to the grid, with no interruption every year. It requires a lot of trust, of course, on both sides. But in the case of Africa, in most African countries, there is no time to wait, because you have 600 million people who don't have access to any modern form of energy, let alone electricity. And these are countries that are the most vulnerable to climate change, to biodiversity loss, to environmental issues and pollution, which are tackling their day-to-day sources of income in large informal sectors. So I think trying to get the numbers to add up, I'm sorry to say, it's going to be a bit a waste of time. Sure. We all know where the money will have to flow. We are making sure, at least in Morocco, that the regulatory framework is there, that the fiscal terms are there, and that the ability of our partners, equity and debt, are enabled to get access to those risk-adjusted returns, because I think that's the key word. If we understand every word of those three terms, risk-adjusted returns, in reinforcing the grid and making sure that you are thinking more creatively about the business model of producing, transporting, and consuming electricity, I think we would be able to win this energy transition. But as I said, we're not in 1810 when we had the first oil development. We're not in 1946 after the Second World War. We're not in 1979. We are in 2023. And we have 600 million people in Africa who are craving access to modern forms of energy. Plus, we also have in Morocco a large industrial tissue that is also craving competitive, low cost and low carbon energy. So I think today, with the challenges that we are facing, we really have to come up with that stream of investments in those bankable projects, including reinforcements of the grid today. So in that $1 to $2 billion of investments, I think we have at least half a billion dollars that goes into reinforcing the grid. And you are all welcome to help us win this challenge, because in addition to reinforcing the grid to give access to our social and economic tissue, to give them access to low-cost, low-carbon energy, we are also wanted to reinforce our interconnection and access to the international markets. And that convergence of energy and carbon markets between Africa, Europe, and I know that we have some of our players in the financial markets, is quite key as well in winning this transition.
Sure. Okay, we've got a few questions from the audience, so perhaps I could just start with you, Caroline. One of the questions from the audience is, if clean energy is still not inclusive in being available and affordable to everyone to solve the energy challenges, what should Africa do to make energy more accessible?
So what should Africa do? Well, let me take some very specific example when it comes to, because indeed it is a big continent. I'll refer to Nigeria very, very specifically. When it comes to ensuring that clean energy, affordable clean energy, has been made a priority, Nigeria has put together an energy transition office, which has been quite relentless with regards to ensuring that all of the different stakeholders are mobilized and are acting in unison to really find solutions to Nigeria's long-term goal when it comes to universal energy access. Earlier on, one of the panelists mentioned one of the panelists was referring to extending the example escapes me. But when it comes to Nigeria, as I was saying, we've put together a private sector working group where you have all of the different provider of capitals working with the government, working with the civil society, and really looking at what exactly is going to take to bring the cost down. I mentioned earlier subsidy, but not only. We mentioned the fact that there are different sources of capital. We have different service provider of capital. And while some do require some very elevated return, some do not. So we have to look at what it will take by different class of assets, what are the different providers of capital available, and make this, and then make that gap, make that bridge between the different providers. And there are already, for instance, initiatives whereby we're working with guarantee providers who can provide a guarantee and then therefore bring the cost of capital down, working with equity provider, debt provider, all that to say that the numbers are high, the amount is tremendous. That being said, because there are different profiles available, we can get to that risk-adjusted return that was mentioned by the minister, and therefore eventually bring the cost down of renewable energy.
Great. Martin, I see you wanted to say something a minute ago, so I'm going to ask you the next question, and perhaps you can tack that on as well.
Sure.
We're just being asked here, what do we need to activate public-private participation projects?
Exactly, that question really helps me to also pick up on this risk-adjusted return. Because one of the points really, as you say, it needs to be risk-adjusted return. And we want to mobilize more renewable energy. So therefore, the price should be high in order to generate high returns for institutional investors. At the same time, we want it to be low, otherwise it can't be catalytic. And so therefore, the price of energy will be set. And as you say, we need to bring the costs down. And so for us, the only way and how we can provide then this public and private to work together is just limit the risks, because electricity prices must be set at a certain point. And this is what we try to do with blended finance, not only on the capital stack, but also in the cooperation. So we run our Emerging Market Climate Action Fund, for example, together with the European Investment Bank on the transactional level to form such partnerships. And I think the future I see in partnerships, also public and private, is not just de-risking, forming a capital stack, but really cooperating. So the grid operators need to understand what the operators of the assets need, what the investors need, and I think this dialogue is quite important, which is why I'm so glad that we're also allowed to be speaking here, because this is the starting point on how you can have that dialogue, and I think then something fruitful can evolve.
All right. Just switching tack a little bit. Othman, you work with gas. There's a lot of talk about hydrogen, green hydrogen. This part of the world is considered to be a place where it could well be developed quite extensively. Is it a threat to gas? Do you see companies like your own transitioning to the use of hydrogen?
I don't consider it as a threat. I think for us, I see it as a chance. Right, because you mentioned gas as a transition. Nobody wants to invest in something that, in 10 years down the road, will be stranded because the policy is more stringent and you cannot use natural gas, or the funding are not available to support it. So hydrogen is the chance to make sure that this dependable capacity and the flexible capacity is still there. So the technology is already today available to burn gas and to produce in gas turbines and combined cycles. And in combination with other technologies as well, we have the carbon capture. But I would like to step back a little, because everybody's thinking, how can we get to zero? But the question is, like what Madame la Ministre said, is about the investment. We need it now. We need also a solution now, because that credit of carbon, CO2, we cannot tap into it until we get the ultimate solution that will nail the CO2 down to zero. Right? So we need to take care about the assets that are there. There are billions of assets that can be upgraded to get more power, to get more efficient power without adding fuel. So these upgrades are available, can be done within a short time. And there is also a lot of assets that are in what we call, even in Morocco, what we call simple cycle, which is barely 30% efficiency. We can put them in a combined cycle and improve the efficiency all the way to around 50%. So it will get you 50% more power without adding fuel, and drop the carbon intensity by 30%. So, and a lot of assets like that are existing in this continent. So that's something we can do in medium term. And we also can displace some of the inefficient assets, you mentioned Nigeria. 13 gigawatts of Nigeria is made by household or small-scale power diesel engine. It's not safe. It's very expensive. So developing high efficient, today the efficiency of combined cycle is around 60%, more than 60%, 64%. So developing those kind of assets will help improving the reliability, and it will help addressing as well the cost of the electricity. And as I said in my introduction, those assets can, when the hydrogen becomes affordable, you know, that's the question. Is it affordable to be used for power generation or not? Not only is it available, but it's also, can we make it affordable? When it will be available, of course, we are happy to switch to hydrogen and have net zero emissions on those power plants.
Okay. Minister, perhaps I can ask you, does Morocco have a vision for hydrogen? Where do you see that fuel playing a role in your country's future?
I think we have, if you remember, Anthony, on November 22nd, we had a meeting with His Majesty the King, and he gave us his instructions to prepare a hydrogen offer. And I think the work is nearly done, and Mr. Prime Minister has announced that we will make the hydrogen offer public before the end of the year. And the whole, I think, understanding and the reason why we are taking our time is because we just see the numbers. And the numbers are, you have probably $390 billion or $400 billion that were announced of capital going into green hydrogen. Less than 8% of that is actually committed. Less than 5%, I think, has reached FID, according to, and I don't want to cite a competing intelligence company. But anyway, I mean, the whole point is our role as a country that went through 15 years of experience in developing renewable projects, a country that sits between Africa, Europe, and the Atlantic basin. So that gives you optionality. And we really want to ensure that in this trajectory towards developing new energies, including hydrogen, green ammonia, batteries and storage, we want to ensure that that risk-adjusted return to our partner, to our partners' investors, is really taken into account. So, in that offer, and I don't want to put the cart before the horse and leave that to when the offer will be announced. I think the whole point there is first trust with our international and national partners in that journey, because that journey will take risks. You know, in all the energy transitions that we've seen since we started using horsepower on real horses, it took at least 50 years for every fuel, be it nuclear, renewables, and so on, to take at least 10% of the global market share on at any specific time. And I think somebody was saying earlier today in the panels, why are we asking green hydrogen to play that role in less than 8 years with a large amount of subsidies from specific countries? I think we are today in a situation where we want to, as Morocco, we want to keep that optionality in our system, make sure that all the infrastructure, and when I talk about infrastructure, I'm not only talking about physical infrastructure, and yesterday we signed an agreement with the IFC to help us in revising and updating our national gas roadmap and preparing the gas infrastructure of Morocco of the future to be hydrogen proof and to enable us in that journey so that at the end of the day we don't end up with stranded assets. Because remember, we want to ensure that in this acceleration, because we are in an acceleration of time compared to the 20th century where, as I mentioned, for those competing technologies, it took 50 years to gain 10% of the global market share. Because of the huge geopolitical and changes and the climate issue that now is becoming very clear and very apparent, especially, I mean, in many countries, not only in Europe and North America, but as I mentioned earlier, in some of the most vulnerable countries, there are some islands that are going to disappear before 2040 or 2050. And that raises for the international community some very unbearable questions of citizenship, of nationality that was never was never in the card. So I think that acceleration of time that we are all facing because of those very difficult questions that we are being tasked to answer will provide the framework and the infrastructure to enable the development of a sustainable in time energy transition, including with new technologies like hydrogen.
Great, thank you. Martin, one more question for you. Sorry, but there's a lot of finance questions coming from the audience. So for infrastructure or energy investment, is the project finance approach the core approach to rely on solely, or should we be looking at corporate finance, access to bond markets and securitization? Perhaps you could just speak about that a little bit. Also, if you could just touch on the global interest rate cycle and how that's complicating matters.
Yeah, maybe starting really with the interest rate cycle. I think this is one of the really imminent problems we can see in equity and debt due to the hike in interest rates. Of course, the referential return required to mobilize private capital flowing, for example, into Africa will also be higher. So coming back to how much revenue can you generate out of an asset on the ground. And I think that also limits what you can do with regards to structuring your specific transaction. So far, project finance, of course, is very interesting also for the institutional investors. We do nevertheless acknowledge that some of the refinancing cycles are really hard to meet with renewables, no matter what size you're talking about. So therefore, also, I guess it's very imminent that different sources of financing must be required. But at the same time, what you also see is that institutional investors, like for example from Europe, who are regulated under solvency, also need to take that into account. So if you talk about permanent capital vehicles, like how can you then get your capital out? And I think until such examples are also set, so really also the institutional investors get data points on how it worked and how it did work in the past, it's very hard to find like very new, like much more new and innovative ways of financing. So therefore, what we do right now is really making the first step in building standard vehicles with a de-risking element, as in blended finance. And I think then we will need to be getting towards more options to also finance the projects on the ground.
Okay, we've just got a few minutes left. So starting with Caroline, I just wanted to ask you all the same question. We've seen the bulk of renewable energy, and I suspect all energy investment take place in just a few countries. South Africa, Morocco, Egypt, maybe one or two others. What do we need to do to spread this investment across the continent? Because we're all facing the same problem. And as we've mentioned several times, about half of all Africans don't have access to electricity. So what do we need to do?
De-risk, de-risk, de-risk. Ultimately, if you want funds to flow to a country, you have to make sure that investors have some visibility with regards to being able to actually reap off the benefits from these investments. You have to have investors who can believe that if they go and invest in a renewable energy project, they have some certainty with regards to, for instance, the tariffs that they can charge, and the fact that there wouldn't be any, due to an election upcoming, a change of tariff being imposed on them, for instance. So ensuring that there is clear visibility sounds basic, but it's the number one thing for investors to know that they can actually go into a country. And how does that work? Regulatory frameworks. I think the countries that you've mentioned have led quite a very clear example of having very clear regulatory frameworks. What does the permitting require, and all of the different steps. Having it clearly laid out allows investors to enter into a country. After that, once you have a very clear regulatory framework, you also obviously have to look at other elements that come into decision makings for investors doing their due diligence. How are they going to get their returns with regards to offtake? What are the different offtake arrangements that are in place? What's going on with the demand? We know that there's a lot of suppressed demand in Africa. How do we exactly right-size that demand and so on? I think that's another important factor as well.
Great. If I can just give you perhaps 30 seconds each. Perhaps, Othman, you could speak to the same points, and then I'll come to the Minister.
Yeah, I'm representing the technology supplier, so I'm dealing with a lot of countries who are now required to think about the energy transition, and it will be more an ask, I mean, to the financial institution, because we've seen a lot of them backing off from funding fossil fuels. I think the government, especially in Africa, I've seen that a lot of government announced their NDC, so they set the objectives. We need to make sure that financial institutions make their decision based on those objectives, on the energy transition, not on the single solutions. Like if this gas power plant is required to achieve the transition, so it has to be funded. And I think that's an important point which will help the countries achieving their objectives.
Okay. Minister, perhaps I can give you the final word.
Thank you very much. I am actually really, really happy because I see, and thanks to Bloomberg New Economy for choosing Morocco for this event, because I think I felt in the discussions that we were having today that we are really at a turning point. And why I'm really happy, because compared to 10 years ago, after the financial crisis, we were all sitting in rooms in our different capacities and listening to people, the financial sector and private sector saying, oh, we need de-risk, de-risk, de-risk. And the government saying, oh, but we need access to low-cost and low-cost capital. And you had also the international community hesitating whether gas is a transition fuel or a destination fuel. And you had all of that hesitation between the different players that just cannot work in the energy transition pathway for any country, let alone for a country in Africa that is basically betting on its energy transition journey. So I'm really happy to see that I think that these three communities are now actually talking to each other and realizing that the time is now, and the amount of, even if we are not having the perfect project with the perfect structuring of the financial stream with project bonds or blended finance, I think at the end of the day, we are pushing ahead. I think in Morocco, in some of the countries that are represented in this room, everything is being put together so that we have those creative solutions put in place.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all the panelists, and thank you for the audience questions.
Please welcome to the stage President of the World Rugby's African Association and Rugby Africa, Herbert Mensah, and our moderator, Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg Opinion, Tim O'Brien.
Sit down, please.
Okay. Thank you.
I always hate being on the same stage with someone who is more handsome, smarter, and more well-spoken than I am, but I'm stuck with this today, so let's soldier on. It's a good topic to soldier on about. We're going to talk about the future of sport in Africa and what it means for economic development in Africa and good, solid local investment in Africa as well. We have a question for all of you, a polling question that I want to start out with so you have some time to think about it. You'll see this up here on the screen up behind me, but The fastest growing sport in Africa will be what by 2040? Basketball, football, rugby, or mixed martial arts wrestling? And if you just scan the QR code, you can register your thoughts on that. We'll come back to it later, because I've learned a lot today about this particular topic, largely from sitting this morning and talking with Herbert, who is the president of World Rugby's Africa Association, Rugby Africa. And welcome to the stage today, Herbert. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Tim.
So sport is obviously a big business elsewhere in the world. Can it really be a big sport in Africa? Can it be a big business in Africa? Can sport be a big business in Africa?
I think so. I mean, it's very much my mantra. I took office 2.5 months ago, and off the back of the fact that I believe that sport is big business. We need to model ourselves, present ourselves to the global world. After all, the best athletes in the world invariably come from Africa. You will find them in different nationalities these days, whether playing for the national teams in Europe, or you see them in NBA finals. The potential in Africa is absolutely massive, so I do believe so.
But they're often extracted from Africa, aren't they? The athletes. And in some ways, it's akin to oil or other commodities. This is a precious natural resource, and it's being deployed elsewhere. Isn't one of the challenges here for the continent, and a continent that's very diverse, many different countries inside of it, is how do you retain that particular resource so its benefits, both financially and culturally, can grow at home?
I think you're absolutely right. I think the opportunities, I was speaking recently to Minister of Sport in a Southern African country, and she was espousing exactly the same, that economically, at a certain point, with that kind of talent, you'll have sportsmen having to move to other continents, to other countries, in order to see their real worth. And I think that's part of the challenge that we have here, is to encourage investment back on our continent, where you will have many, if we talk in rugby terms, there's the extraordinary player called the Beast, who's from Zimbabwe and played in the World Cup and is larger than life, and had to leave Zimbabwe to go through to South Africa to show his greatness. And we have many up in North Africa who go across to France to play, and West Africa, where I come from. I played rugby in England for Saracens, so people go out of their home territories out. And I think the key is to bring the investment back into Africa, and for the rest of the world to understand that you can actually grow here, develop here, and the market is global rather than linked into Europe or America.
So let's talk about some of the hurdles around bringing investment back to Africa. We have the historical legacy. It's a mix of both expropriation, racism, a lack of interest, elitism, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a historical legacy to overcome, the roots of which are still present. And then there's just the current realities. Investors have other options. Investors may feel that they have other both regions and sports that are more profitable investments. So from where you sit, what has to happen structurally and culturally for this to take off here?
I think look, Tim, you're absolutely right. Every knife is double-edged. And we look at the first part of what you said is absolutely true, that there is a historical relationship that Africa has with the global world, where it's easier to take product rather than to invest, to create situations and models where it's not necessarily in the interests of Africa, and we have to change that. I think what I'm trying to do in part of my period is asking for a major mindset change, a shift. So when I speak to my colleagues at World Rugby, I'm saying, you need to change the way that you look at us. I once came from the world of football, and we were all involved in petitioning FIFA and global bodies to give Africa more chance, rather than say, you're not good enough. When you get good enough, we'll give you the chance. Invest in us today. And we saw what happened in Qatar with this great country of Morocco and Cameroon and
Ghana and the likes. But Morocco certainly sent the world on fire for people to understand that there are only players who have their qualities are born out of where they come from as opposed to elsewhere. If you had that investment and you can look at, if it is football, you look at Hakimi and you look at, the goalkeeper and the rest, we have the same in rugby. Mario Itoje today is playing for England and he's recognized as one of the best in that field. We need a mindset.
Why don't the Mario Itojes of the world, or the Beast? Someday I hope someone calls me the Beast. Why don't both of them stay in Africa? What's preventing young athletes from finding a home in the sport, whether it's rugby, whether it's football, and of course, many African athletes go overseas for basketball and other U.S.-centric sports.
I think at the end of the day, it's all about money. The money that's invested is taken along. Unfortunately, like everything, the money that's invested, players and families and people have a choice as to how they see the next 10, 20, 30 years of their life, especially sports that you have a shorter lifespan. We need to get the global bodies, if it's my sport, rugby, if it's others, and they're all on their own missions, to invest more. But we, as well, within Africa, need to re-examine ourselves, our policies on sports and education. Look, I had the honor of meeting an extraordinary gentleman yesterday here, and that was the Minister of Youth and Sports here in Morocco. And listening to his rollout plan, which involves education and sports, was something to behold.
And you've told me that, there are more than 50 countries in Africa, and you have a very different experience every time you visit each one of them in terms of the kind of reception you get, the kind of collaboration you get. What makes Morocco or any other country that you see as a successful collaborator successful?
Well, I think the present future is really a marriage between governments, where there is a responsibility. If you take the values that rugby has, it has, I would say, better values than many other sports in terms of bringing up young people and letting them understand the values of respect, of teamwork, of collaboration, of patience, of other things like that. So the marriage with government first and foremost, and we need African governments to also invest in the games. We have some, my own country, I have an extraordinary president, and we're building a first purpose-built rugby stadium. It might seem a big deal, but it is.
Rwanda, notably, has done the same.
He is really championing the development of sport. We've had...
Those are governments that are populated by people with real expertise and a focus on a partnership that achieves mutual goals, right? Both for the sport and for the locality.
Absolutely, you're right. I think there's also a realization that, look, if you've got young people involved in sports, they're not going to get up to mischief. I think it doesn't matter how hard things are economically.
Rugby makes you a better parent.
Rugby makes you, at least it does, I think. Very much so.
Yeah. From the outside, we've talked about this idea of money returning to the base. And that's true of any business in any locality. To what extent is wealth and value extracted? To what extent does it remain behind and create a full-blooded, robust local ecosystem? Can sport ever be a full-blown economic development tool in the way that other entertainment industries are, or other types of industries are, in terms of not just being episodic? We have a great debate in the United States about big stadiums that are built with taxpayer funds, and then they sort of become one-offs and don't have longevity in terms of economic growth. Do you think that sports is a long-term economic development tool in Africa?
I think so, very much so. I think you just need to drive through Africa, as diverse as it is culturally and in every other way, and there'll be a young kid with a ball of some sort, more so than you will have anywhere else. It becomes very much part and parcel. And I think that when we look at development models, we should really look at the lifestyle and culture of the people, what they do, and sport very much is one. Just digressing a little bit, I was so proud recently in the Champions League final, not only to see the plethora of Africans there, but to see Burna Boy as the main musician afterwards and everybody going up to them. So we do have musicians, if we move laterally, who are global today, who have great pride in being Africans and coming back home. We need to press that button of investment that says, not only do you give opportunity to Africans in Africa, but then you have other industries that will build up from it, other growth areas that will build up from it, which will benefit everybody at the end of the day.
You know, there's been a number of demographic studies that already indicate that by 2100, 40% of the world's population will be in Africa. Do you think that institutionally Africans have enough voice commensurate with both their future potential and the present realities of what's on the ground here, specifically in sports?
No, I don't. I think there are battles within battles. The battle of playing sport, I've always said as a business person, you need to win off the field in order to win on the field. So when I get involved in any form of sports development, it's getting it right off the field. And in this case, it's taking on governments, it's taking on our global bodies, it's seeking greater equity. I mean, the fact that Africa, for example, with 50-odd countries and 30-something all affiliated to Rugby Africa have 2 votes at World Rugby, when individual developed countries have 3 apiece, means that you can't force them to equity in terms of investment, in terms of whatever. You have to find different means of getting there. So we need to fight battles off the field, not only with global bodies and with our governments, with lending agencies. We're going to the World Cup in France this year, which is the second biggest sporting event in the world after the FIFA World Cup football. Rugby is the second biggest sport in the world. And
I did not know that till we had breakfast this morning.
Absolutely,
I had other biases out of my ignorance. Yeah.
And the fact that if you take in Europe and in the West, rugby is played mainly amongst elite and better educated and the custodians of capital and business and money. I see a few smiling faces. So I know they're rugby players, ex-ones there. If I see them limping afterwards, I know they're rugby players. I know. I'll definitely know. So surely, since they control so much capital, it shouldn't be so difficult as they look to invest in Africa and bring about change.
There are some practical things investors will look for. For example, any sport rides on the back of a strong broadcasting presence, an ability for people to watch a sport on television. It's as important a partnership as government or capital or talent. That is another hurdle the continent as a whole has to overcome, isn't it? Just building out an accessible, affordable broadcasting network.
No, you're absolutely right. The dogged history, which I don't like going back to, of the fact of who are we and where we came from is a reality, because we don't have one Sky TV that covers the whole continent of Africa. Francophone Africa thinks in one way, Anglophone Africa thinks in one way, and North Africa also operates differently. So when you start looking at continental models, it becomes an issue. One of the things that we are doing in coming into power is looking first at a complete constitutional review to empower us to move forward, checking our own internal governance systems. But it's also looking and saying we should need to split Africa east-west, north-south. It's far easier to raise money when you look and say, in West Africa, there are 400 or 450 odd million people.
West Africa alone is a bigger market than the United States,
absolutely.
Potentially.
So how do we then make that work into one model? How do we then look at the East African bloc, who are the premiers of rugby, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Uganda, and the likes? How do we deal up here with North Africa as a separate entity? And I think when it is we start doing that, then we can start broaching the issue of TV rights and the rest, which is so easy in Europe and America to sign off because you've got one carrier. I mean, here we've been dealing with, and we've signed partnerships with Apio, and I'm very happy about that because they are a continental rebroadcaster of news. But it is very much, we stream a lot of the things and we're taking a slightly different approach. You then come back to governments and state broadcasters and what it is they can put out are the same. But the commercial value of where they are is not quite there. But then there's the opportunity for the people with money to see that opportunity.
Think long term.
To look medium to long term.
Did we get an answer from our poll? I don't see one up yet.
I haven't voted yet, so.
You haven't voted, so we'll wait for your vote to come in. And we've run out of time. Herbert Mensah, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim.
Thank you.
Please welcome back to the stage Eric Schatzker.
Everybody, brings us, I should say, to the end of the morning session. I want to thank you for being here. Hope you'll come back. I think you'll notice a number of themes have started to emerge through these conversations, among them the deficit in infrastructure, the need for more private capital, and you'll hear more about that on the other side of this lunch break. I'd like you to take a few minutes. In fact, it's more than a few minutes, about an hour and a quarter. If you could please be back here promptly at 2:30 for the afternoon program. Your speakers, your fellow delegates, and I would be most grateful. If you have plans to join a breakout session, there should be details about the breakouts appearing right behind me. They begin very soon, in about 5 minutes. They're on the other side of the little reflecting pool here behind the plenary hall in the networking space, and you'll see they're very prominently posted. You'll find the Next Unicorns, which is catalyzing entrepreneurship across Africa, and also Morocco's green assets and Africa's major role in decarbonizing the world. Those are the two breakout sessions happening in 5 short minutes. There is a buffet lunch on the other side of the plenary hall here, and over there, if you're going to breakouts, please pick up a boxed lunch. You'll see them sitting there, waiting outside. Once again, folks, please be back here at 2:30 promptly. I'll see you then.